In the first half of the 20th century, the Pacific Ocean became less a geographic barrier and more a potential battlefield. Two powers with growing industrial bases and naval traditions, the United States and Japan, watched each other across an expanse that connected California, Hawaii, the Philippines, and the Japanese home islands. The memory of the First World War and the Washington and London naval treaties shaped how both states planned for a future conflict. Battleships were still seen as symbols of status, but within their fleets a newer arm was gaining influence: carrier aviation. The eventual duel between the American Wildcat and the Japanese Zero emerged from this wider contest over sea control, access to resources, and political influence in East Asia and the Pacific. For Japanese leaders, the 1930s brought both opportunity and constraint. Military operations in China, after 1937, pulled the empire deeper into a continental war, while the idea of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere promised a block of territories supplying food, oil, and raw materials. At the same time, dependence on imported fuel, especially from the United States and the Netherlands East Indies, created strategic vulnerability. Naval officers and aircraft designers interpreted this situation in operational terms. They needed forces that could strike far from Japan, fight over long distances, and defeat numerically superior opponents before industrial output could decide the war. Land-based and carrier-based air power became central to this plan. In the United States, the Pacific was seen through a different lens. American administrations regarded the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii as forward positions that had to be supplied and reinforced across thousands of kilometers of ocean. Public sentiment in the 1930s was cautious about foreign war, and budgets for the fleet and for naval aviation were constrained. Yet within the Navy, a community of officers and engineers argued that aircraft launched from carriers could extend the reach of the battle line, scout for enemy forces, and defend the fleet against air attack. Exercises in the interwar period, including mock carrier raids on the Panama Canal and Pearl Harbor, gradually demonstrated that aircraft could threaten even the most heavily armed bases and ships. Technological development followed these strategic debates. In Japan, combat in China provided harsh experience for naval air units. Pilots flew long-range escort missions and ground attack sorties, learning how fragile earlier designs were and how exhausting long-distance flight could be. When the A6M fighter was developed, its designers prioritized range, climb rate, and maneuverability. To achieve these traits, they accepted very low structural weight, minimal cockpit armor, and fuel tanks that were not self-sealing. The resulting aircraft could escort bombers over distances of more than 1,000 kilometers and outturn most contemporaries, fitting Japanese doctrine for offensive operations over the ocean and over the Chinese mainland. In the United States, carrier fighters evolved under different constraints. Designers had to work with catapults, arrestor gear, and the prospect of hard carrier landings in all weather. Naval leadership required rugged airframes, strong undercarriages, and fuel and oil systems protected against leaks and fire. The F4F Wildcat emerged from this environment as a compact, relatively heavy fighter with folding wings, armor around the cockpit, and self-sealing fuel tanks. Armament requirements emphasized multiple heavy machine guns that could damage bombers and attack aircraft threatening the fleet. On paper, its maximum speed and rate of climb compared unfavorably with lighter land-based fighters, but it reflected a specific set of naval priorities. By 1940 and 1941, both air arms were moving toward a confrontation that neither population fully anticipated. Japanese naval air groups, built around carefully selected and intensively trained pilots, had accumulated combat experience in China and long hours of formation, flying, and carrier operations. On the American side, the Navy and Marine Corps were expanding their aviation branches, but training curricula, tactical manuals, and intelligence assessments often relied on pre-war assumptions. Reports of Japanese aircraft performance from China were sometimes dismissed or treated as exaggerations. Many American officers expected any future war to begin with battleship actions and only gradually shift to carrier-based operations. The balance of preparedness was therefore uneven and complex. Japanese forces aimed to achieve a rapid series of blows that would remove the U.S. Pacific Fleet from the Western Pacific and secure a defensive perimeter. American planning rested on the expectation of a long war in which shipyards and factories would gradually mobilize a far larger output of aircraft and carriers. Within that framework, the Wildcat and the Zero were not isolated engineering projects, but the flying expression of two different strategic calculations. As tensions rose over embargoes, basing rights, and diplomatic ultimatums in 1941, these aircraft were already present on flight decks and airfields, waiting for political decisions to turn them into instruments of war. The transition from tension to open conflict in the Pacific came on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier forces struck Hawaii and, almost simultaneously, moved against the Philippines, Malaya, and other Allied positions. At Pearl Harbor, 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves against battleships, airfields, and infrastructure. Among the attacking formations were A6M fighters tasked with providing cover, suppressing American aircraft on the ground, and engaging any interceptors that managed to take off. On the American side, a small number of Navy and Marine F4Fs were present in Hawaii and in the wider Pacific, but most were caught on the ground or at distant outposts, limiting any immediate fighter response. The same day and the days that followed, the pattern of early encounters began to form far from Hawaii. In the Philippines, Japanese land-based bombers and fighters targeted Clark Field, Nichols Field, and other installations. A6Ms flying from Formosa and later from forward bases escorted bombers over long distances, using their range to strike repeatedly. American Army Air Force's units in the archipelago primarily flew interceptors of other types, but naval planners observing these attacks recorded performance estimates for the Japanese fighters. Reports noted high climb rates and tight turning ability, even if the exact model designation was not always identified correctly. One of the first places where the Wildcat and the Zero confronted each other more directly was Wake Island, a small atoll west of Hawaii. There, Marine Squadron VMF 211 operated a limited number of F4F-3S from a basic airstrip. Japanese forces initially attacked with land-based bombers, with A6Ms appearing later as carrier groups were sent to neutralize the garrison. The Marines faced shortages of spare parts, fuel, and prepared shelters, while Japanese crews operated from carriers with established support systems. In several engagements over the island in December 1941, Wildcats intercepted attacking formations and managed to destroy or damage bombers and fighters. But attrition and the loss of aircraft on the ground gradually reduced their numbers. As Japanese advances continued into early 1942, the presence of A6Ms expanded over a widening front. Carrier and land-based groups supported landings in the Netherlands East Indies, New Britain, and along the northern coast of New Guinea. Their tasks included fighter sweeps over airfields, escort for bombers, and patrols over invasion convoys. Allied forces in these areas often relied on mixed groups of older fighters and a small number of F4Fs, flown by Navy and Marine pilots. For many of these pilots, these first contacts revealed that their aircraft could not easily match the climb or turning radius of the Japanese fighter in conventional dogfights at medium altitude. On American carriers, the Wildcat entered the war as the standard fleet fighter. Air groups composed of F4Fs, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers trained for interception and fleet defense while still absorbing lessons from the opening blows. Commanders of the Pacific Fleet, operating from damaged bases and with reduced battleship strength, began to employ their carriers more independently. Raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands in early 1942, although small in scale, brought Wildcat pilots into contact with Japanese defenders and provided further data on the capabilities of the Zero and other enemy types. For Japanese naval aviation, the opening phase seemed to confirm pre-war expectations that well-trained air groups flying long range, agile fighters could dominate the skies over dispersed island bases. For American naval and marine aviators, the same encounters highlighted weaknesses in doctrine, training, and intelligence assessments about Japanese aircraft performance. Individual pilots and squadron leaders began to record detailed observations about the Zero's behavior in turns, dives, and climbs. These notes, still tentative and incomplete, formed the first layer of practical experience that would later be systematized into tactical instructions. In the closing months of 1941 and the opening months of 1942, the Wildcat and the Zero were no longer abstract design solutions, but daily presences in a rapidly expanding war zone, shaping the decisions of commanders and the survival of crews on both sides. As the first months of the war passed, the air duel between Wildcat and Zero moved from improvised responses to more deliberate planning. Staff officers in Tokyo and Washington examined combat reports, pilot debriefings, and intelligence summaries to refine how these fighters would be used in the next phase. The Japanese Navy sought to preserve the initiative gained in late 1941, while the United States aimed to keep a viable carrier force in the Pacific, protect sea routes to Australia, and prepare for counteroffensives. Within these larger goals, the role of carrier-based fighters was reconsidered in terms of numbers, missions, and tactics. For Japanese planners, the A6M remained a central tool for offensive operations. The strategic concept of seizing a wide perimeter from the Aleutians through the Solomons and into the Indian Ocean depended on long-range air cover for convoys and strike forces. Fighter units were expected to escort bombers over distances that could exceed 800 or 900 kilometers, sweep enemy airfields before landings, and defend the fleet during enemy counterattacks. Pre-war training had produced pilots capable of close formation, flying, coordinated gunnery, and fuel management over extended missions. Staff work in early 1942 largely assumed that this cadre, supported by replacement pilots trained in a demanding syllabus, could sustain operations across multiple theaters. The technical assumptions behind Japanese planning also remained consistent. Aircraft production programs continued to prioritize the A6M and related designs with similar emphasis on agility and range. Armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks were introduced only slowly and in limited forms, as any increase in weight threatened to reduce performance characteristics that pilots and commanders considered essential. Carrier air group tables of organization typically allotted fighters to a minority of the total aircraft on board, often around one-third, with the remainder allocated to dive bombers and torpedo bombers intended to deliver decisive blows against enemy ships. This balance reflected a belief that offensive striking power would be more important than layered fighter defense if enemy forces could be located and hit first. On the American side, the Bureau of Aeronautics and Fleet Commanders had to reconcile several demands. The Wildcat was the standard carrier fighter in production, and by early 1942, it equipped air groups on the carriers Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Saratoga, and others entering service. Planners expected these ships to screen reinforcement convoys, raid forward Japanese bases, and, when necessary, contest amphibious operations. Production schedules aimed to supply both the fleet and marine land-based squadrons, with factories in the United States increasing output even under the constraints of retooling and the need to expand the pilot training pipeline. In parallel, design work continued on successor types, but for the immediate future, the F4F had to carry the main burden. American doctrine at the start of the war had emphasized relatively tight formations and interception tactics based on pre-war assumptions about enemy bomber and fighter performance. Many manuals were written with European scenarios in mind, or with limited technical knowledge of Japanese aircraft. As reports accumulated from Wake, the Marshalls, and the Dutch East Indies, they began to show patterns. Enemy fighters that could outclimb and outturn the F4F at certain altitudes, frequent use of high-speed slashing attacks against Allied formations, and a willingness to engage at low speeds where the Zero's wing and control design offered advantages. Early tactical notes suggested using the Wildcat's sturdy construction and diving characteristics, but formal doctrine lagged behind practice at the squadron level. Logistics and basing also shaped planning for both fighters. Japanese naval air units operated from a mixture of fleet carriers, seaplane tenders, and forward island airfields that required continuous effort to supply with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The long range of the Zero reduced the need for multiple intermediate bases, but it also meant that maintenance had to be performed under often austere conditions at newly captured airstrips. American Wildcats, by contrast, were supported by a growing but still limited network of bases from Hawaii to Samoa and Australia. Carrier groups depended on oilers and supply ships to maintain operations at sea. Decisions about where to commit scarce fighters involved not only tactical needs, but also the capacity of each side's logistical system to support sustained deployments. Intelligence assessments influenced these plans in different ways. Japanese analysts monitored American carrier movements, radio traffic, and reconnaissance reports, but often had incomplete or outdated information on American production capacity and new aircraft types. Many estimates assumed that U.S. industrial mobilization, while significant, would take several years to translate into large numbers of modern carrier fighters in the Pacific. American intelligence on the Zero was initially fragmented, with reports under various code names and uncertainty about its exact performance envelope. Nevertheless, photographs, wreckage analysis, and pilot testimony gradually led to more accurate technical profiles, which in turn started to inform training lectures and briefing materials for Wildcat units. Propaganda and public communication provided a separate layer of interpretation. Japanese media presented the Zero as a symbol of national technology and as proof of the Navy's ability to dominate the skies over the Pacific. American statements emphasized the resilience of carrier and marine aviators and the toughness of their equipment, including the Wildcat's ability to return with significant battle damage. These narratives did not determine tactical doctrine, but they influenced expectations among pilots, ground crews, and civilian audiences. They also made it harder at times to adjust doctrine quickly when realities in the field contradicted earlier assumptions. Within this framework of strategic objectives, logistical calculations, and evolving intelligence, the coming carrier battles of 1942 were prepared. The Wildcat and the Zero were assigned specific roles and plans for operations in the Coral Sea, around Midway, and along the supply routes to Australia. Commanders on both sides entered these engagements with doctrines that were partly validated and partly untested, relying on their fighters to protect strike groups, challenge enemy reconnaissance, and decide control of the air over key sea areas. The clash that followed would test not only the machines themselves, but also the planning assumptions that had guided their design, production, and deployment. The first sustained tests of Wildcat and Zero doctrine came in a series of scattered but significant engagements in early 1942. In February, American carriers struck the Marshall and Gilbert Islands with small task forces built around Enterprise and Yorktown. Each ship carried roughly 18 to 20 F4Fs, alongside dive bombers and torpedo bombers. Japanese bases on atolls such as Kwajalein, Woche, and Jaluit housed small detachments of A6Ms and other aircraft. In these raids, Wildcats flew combat air patrol over the carriers and escorted strike groups. Zero pilots, alerted by radar or visual sightings, attempted to intercept incoming bombers and pursue withdrawing formations. Losses on both sides were limited in absolute numbers, but the encounters gave each air arm its first systematic data on the other fighter and fleet operations. Further west, the carrier strike on Lae and Salamaua in New Guinea in March 1942 showed how these fighters could influence land campaigns. American carriers launched aircraft over the Owen Stanley Range to attack Japanese shipping and airfields, supporting operations against Port Moresby. 4Fs escorted the bombers across mountainous terrain and over enemy positions, engaging defending fighters when encountered. Japanese units in the area, including A6Ms from land bases, were tasked with defending convoys and forward airstrips. For local civilian populations and ground forces, these air battles appeared as sudden, high-speed intrusions over jungles and harbors. But for the naval staffs, they were test cases for long-range coordination between sea and land-based air power. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May 1942 brought the first large-scale carrier versus carrier confrontation in which Wildcats and Zeros directly contested air superiority over a limited sea area. The United States deployed two fleet carriers, Lexington and Yorktown, with a combined air group of around 120 aircraft, including roughly 40 F4Fs. Japan committed 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, plus the light carrier Shoho, with a similar total of about 120 aircraft and around 40 A6Ms. Over several days, strike groups from both sides launched, searched, and attacked without surface ships ever sighting each other. In the air battles that developed as bombers and torpedo aircraft approached their targets, Wildcats attempted to form interception screens while Zeros flew escort and counter-intercept roles. In these engagements, the technical and doctrinal differences between the fighters became more visible. Pilots reported that Zeros could climb rapidly to intercept incoming formations and execute tight horizontal turns to stay behind F4Fs in prolonged maneuvers. Wildcat pilots increasingly relied on diving attacks and coordinated maneuvers to avoid being drawn into sustained turning fights. For the Japanese side, the battle demonstrated that fighter escorts could protect strike groups against interception at several points along their routes, but also that maintaining continuous coverage over long distances strained fuel reserves. Several returning aircraft landed with minimal reserves after extended combat and transit. The outcome of Coral Sea had direct territorial implications. Japanese plans to land at Port Moresby by sea were canceled after the loss of Shoho and damage to Shokaku, while Zuikaku's depleted air group required reorganization. The United States lost Lexington and suffered serious damage to Yorktown, but retained a carrier presence in the Pacific. For military and civilian observers in Australia and New Guinea, the result meant that Port Moresby remained in Allied hands, influencing the subsequent land campaign over the Kokoda Track. For Japanese planners, it marked the first major operation in the Pacific in which an offensive objective was not fully achieved, despite significant commitment of carrier air power. 1 month later, at Midway in June 1942, the duel between Wildcat and Zero intensified. The Japanese fleet advanced with 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, fielding about 248 aircraft, 24 including roughly 70 to 80 A6Ms. The United States deployed 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, with around 230 aircraft and approximately 80 F4Fs. Early in the battle, Wildcats flew defense over Midway Atoll and later over the carriers, attempting to protect dive bombers and torpedo aircraft as they approached the Japanese task force. Zeros alternated between sweeping attacks on Midway's airstrip, escorting their own bombers, and intercepting American strike waves. In the attacks on Japanese carriers, particularly those involving American torpedo squadrons, the limitations and strengths of both fighters were thrown into focus. Torpedo bombers flying at low altitude and modest speed were vulnerable to A6Ms, which used their climb and turn to break up formations before they could launch. Wildcats assigned as escort often faced unfavorable height and position when Japanese fighters intercepted from above. At the same time, some F4F divisions began to apply tactics that exploited their aircraft's sturdiness and high-speed dives, using cooperative maneuvers to cover each other when pursued. These engagements produced cumulative attrition among experienced Japanese pilots and taught American carrier groups that success depended on coordination between fighters, bombers, and radar-directed control. For the crews involved, these first major carrier battles defined their perception of the opponent. Japanese pilots noted that the F4F could absorb significant damage and still remain controllable or return to its carrier, influencing their gunnery practices and target selection. American pilots and intelligence officers collected details on Zero armament, fuel system vulnerability, and behavior at higher speeds, gradually refining performance charts. For sailors and ground personnel on Midway, New Guinea, and the islands affected by these clashes, the practical meaning of the Wildcat Zero duel lay in whether convoys reached their destinations, whether bases remained supplied, and whether the front line moved closer to or farther from their communities. From mid-1942, the air duel between Wildcat and Zero became tied to a wider crisis in the South Pacific. After Midway, Japanese planners shifted attention to the Solomon Islands as part of a barrier protecting Rabaul and the approaches to New Guinea. Construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal was intended to extend land-based air coverage toward the south and threatened sea routes between the United States, New Caledonia, and Australia. In Washington and Canberra, this development was interpreted as a direct risk to reinforcement lines. When American forces landed on Guadalcanal and nearby Tulagi in August 1942, they initiated a campaign in which air superiority, contested daily by F-4s and Fs and A6Ms, would determine control of a narrow but critical sea corridor. On Guadalcanal, the captured airstrip at Lunga Point was renamed Henderson Field and quickly became the focus of operations. Marine, Navy, and later Army squadrons brought in by transport and escort carriers assembled a mixed force of fighters, dive bombers, and medium bombers, often referred to collectively as the Cactus Air Force. At various points in late 1942, this force possessed between 20 and 40 operational Wildcats, supplemented by other fighter types. Japanese commands at Rabaul and other bases deployed A6M units to fly from Buin, Shortland, and the newly prepared strip at Lunga when they could temporarily regain it, aiming to neutralize Henderson, cover convoys, and attrit Allied air power. Carrier operations in the surrounding seas escalated the crisis. In August 1942, at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the United States deployed Enterprise and Saratoga with roughly 170 aircraft, including around 60 F-4Fs. Opposing them were Japanese carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo, with a similar total of aircraft and about 70 A6Ms. Wildcats flew combat air patrol over the carriers and escorted strike groups sent against Japanese ships approaching Guadalcanal. Zeros attempted to shield their own bombers and to break through to attack American carriers. Losses in aircraft and one light carrier on the Japanese side, balanced against damage to Enterprise and the sinking of several American ships, underlined that neither fleet could operate safely near the island without fighter cover. As the campaign continued, the pattern of daily air battles over and around Guadalcanal imposed heavy strain on both air arms. Japanese pilots often flew from Rabaul to the island, a round trip of more than 1,000 kilometers, which left limited time over the target area and little fuel margin for extended engagements. A6Ms escorting bombers or conducting sweeps had to balance aggressive maneuvers with strict fuel discipline. American Wildcats based at Henderson Field had the advantage of operating from a nearby airstrip, but ground crews faced shortages of spare parts, aviation fuel, and prepared shelter. Aircraft were frequently repaired in improvised conditions, and operational strength fluctuated sharply as machines were damaged, cannibalized, or returned to service. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October 1942 illustrated how these cumulative pressures affected carrier forces. The United States fielded the carriers Hornet and Enterprise with approximately 130 aircraft and about 70 F-4Fs. Japan brought Shokaku, Zuikaku, Zuiho, and Junyo with close to 200 aircraft, including roughly 80 A6Ms. In multiple waves, Zeros escorted strike groups that located and attacked the American carriers, while Wildcats attempted to form layered defensive circles directed by radar and fighter controllers. Hornet was eventually sunk, and Enterprise was damaged, but Japanese air groups also suffered significant fighter and bomber losses, many involving aviators with long pre-war and early war experience. For individual pilots and commanders, the Guadalcanal crisis revealed the limits of existing doctrines. Japanese tactics that relied on high skill levels and numerically modest but very capable fighter units encountered the problem of replacement. Training programs in Japan could not easily replace the number of experienced A6M pilots lost over the Solomons and at sea. On the American side, squadron leaders flying Wildcats learned that strict adherence to earlier close formation concepts increased vulnerability. They experimented more systematically with cooperative diving attacks and vertical maneuvers, taking advantage of the F-4F's structural strength and controlled behavior in high-speed dives. Terrain and weather added further complications. The mountainous interior of Guadalcanal, frequent tropical storms, and limited ground infrastructure influenced how both fighters were used. Pilots navigated over jungle and open sea with few visual landmarks, and clouds or rain showers could appear rapidly between base and target area. Forced landings or ditchings into the sea were common outcomes of battle damage or fuel miscalculation. For local Solomon Islanders, these air battles brought debris, crashed aircraft, and wounded airmen to remote villages and coasts. Some assisted downed Japanese and American crews. Others were conscripted as labor by occupying forces or by Allied units building and maintaining airstrips. The broader political context intensified the stakes of this air campaign. In Tokyo, the inability to eliminate Henderson Field and secure Guadalcanal raised questions within the Navy and the Army about priorities between the Solomons, New Guinea, and other fronts. In Washington and London, the defense of the island was presented as proof that supply lines to Australia could be held, and that offensive action in the Pacific was possible, even while large ground forces were committed to North Africa and preparations for operations in Europe. Within this environment, the duel between Wildcat and Zero was not an isolated technical comparison, but a central element of an escalating struggle over a specific island and, by extension, over the strategic geometry of the South Pacific. By late 1942, the duel between Wildcat and Zero reached a level of sustained combat that tested the capacities of both navies. Around Guadalcanal, air battles occurred on many days when weather and serviceable aircraft allowed. At Henderson Field, the number of operational F4Fs could fluctuate from fewer than 10 to more than 30 within a week, depending on arrivals, combat damage, and maintenance. Japanese A6M units at Rabaul and forward bases rotated squadrons to keep a presence over the island, but by the end of the year, many formations had lost a significant proportion of their original, pre-war trained pilots. For the local population, this meant recurring raids, damaged villages, and the presence of multiple armed forces competing for resources and labor. At sea, the naval battles off Guadalcanal in November 1942 connected surface and air power in a single complex campaign. When Japanese forces attempted to reinforce the island and bombard Henderson Field, American carriers and land-based aircraft sought to disrupt these convoys. On November 14th, for example, F-4Fs from Henderson and from the carrier Enterprise took part in attacks on Japanese transports and escorting warships. Zeros from Rabaul and other locations tried to shield these movements and intercept Allied aircraft. The losses in ships and aircraft on both sides, combined with the attrition already suffered in preceding months, drove Japanese naval leaders to reconsider whether the island could be held at acceptable cost. Decisions in Tokyo and at the combined fleet headquarters reflected this accumulated strain. Naval leadership had to evaluate the balance between the Solomons, New Guinea, and the defense of Truk, Rabaul, and the Central Pacific. The Army argued for concentration on New Guinea, while the Navy emphasized the importance of the Solomon Islands chain for protecting the flank of Rabaul. Reports detailing aircraft losses in the Solomons, including significant numbers of Zeros and their experienced crews, were weighed against production figures and the capacity of training establishments. In early 1943, the decision was taken to evacuate remaining Japanese ground forces from Guadalcanal, an operation carried out under cover of destroyers and supported by fighters and bombers that still included A6Ms. For the United States, the same period marked both a peak in operational effort and a transition in material strength. Shipyards on the West Coast and on the Atlantic seaboard were commissioning new carriers, while factories increased monthly output of naval aircraft. Yet in the South Pacific, the number of fighter slots on flight decks remained finite, and F-4Fs continued to form the backbone of carrier fighter complements. Escort carriers entering service in late 1942 and 1943 carried small fighter groups, often about 12 Wildcats each, to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious landings. This extended the presence of the F-4F into areas where land-based Zeros operated from newly built Japanese airfields. In parallel, a different theater presented another form of the duel. In the North Pacific, around the Aleutian Islands, Japanese forces occupied Attu and Kiska in mid-1942. A-6Ms operating from northern bases supported these outposts and confronted American aircraft in a harsh climate of fog, low temperatures, and strong winds. U.S. Navy and Army units, including F-4Fs from escort carriers, flew patrols and strike missions under conditions very different from the Solomons. The aircraft themselves faced icing, limited visibility, and short daylight hours. For inhabitants of Alaska and the Aleutians, including indigenous communities, the air battles brought the war directly into regions that had previously experienced little military activity. The human cost of sustaining this peak level of operations extended beyond the front lines. In Japan, naval aviation schools shortened training programs to increase output, reducing the number of flight hours that replacement pilots received before joining Zero units. Families received casualty notifications from campaigns whose geography was often unfamiliar, with place names such as Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, and Buna entering public discourse. In the United States, casualty lists from the Pacific accompanied news of expanding production, bond drives, and the commissioning of new carriers and aircraft types. Workers in factories building F-4Fs encountered these names in newspapers and radio broadcasts, linking their daily routines to events thousands of kilometers away. Command decisions on both sides increasingly recognized that the characteristics of Wildcat and Zero were only one element in a wider system. Fuel allocations, maintenance intervals, pilot rotation policies, and the availability of radar and early warning shaped when and where these fighters could be brought to bear. During late 1942 and early 1943, the Pacific War still centered on relatively few airfields and carrier groups, so each loss of a squadron or ship had disproportionate effects. The concentration of air combat in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Aleutians meant that for a period, the duel between F-4Fs and A6Ms represented the most visible expression of naval air power in the Pacific, even as both sides prepared new aircraft types and revised training to meet the demands of a prolonged conflict. Through 1943, both sides altered the way they used their fighters in an effort to adapt to a long war. For American forces, one important development was the more systematic adoption and dissemination of new tactics for Wildcats. Experiences from Midway and Guadalcanal, including cooperative maneuvers devised by squadron leaders, were circulated in formal memoranda and training bulletins. The concept of pairing F-4Fs in formations that could support each other during diving and climbing maneuvers was taught to new pilots arriving from the United States. Training squadrons on the mainland incorporated these lessons into flight exercises so that aviators who had never seen a Zero in combat practiced responses to its known strengths in turning and climbing. On the Japanese side, commanders also tried to adjust. Reports from the Solomons and New Guinea noted that American fighters increasingly avoided protracted horizontal maneuvering and preferred diving attacks from altitude. A6M units were instructed to improve lookout discipline, maintain formation coherence in the vertical as well as horizontal plane, and coordinate more closely with bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Some squadrons experimented with modified climb and dive profiles to counter high-speed attacks by F-4Fs. At the same time, the reduction in average pilot experience level made it harder to implement complex tactical changes, especially when units were under constant operational pressure. Material adaptation accompanied these doctrinal shifts. In American factories, later versions of the F-4F incorporated small improvements in armor layout, engine reliability, and folding wing mechanisms to suit carrier storage. Production of escort carriers expanded, placing more Wildcats on convoy and amphibious operation duty. Newer types such as the F-6F began to appear on fleet carriers, but the F-4F remained important on smaller decks and remote airstrips. This created a layered system in which different fighter generations coexisted, and training commands had to prepare pilots for multiple aircraft with distinct performance envelopes. Japanese industry attempted to refine the Zero and to introduce successor designs with greater speed and, in some cases, more protection. However, constraints in aluminum supply, engine development, and dispersed manufacturing limited the scale and pace of these changes. Modifications to existing A6Ms to add some armor or partial fuel tank protection increased weight and reduced range. forcing staff officers to reconsider route profiles and mission durations. Some naval air units received newer fighters in small numbers, but for many carrier and land-based groups, the A6M remained the primary equipment well into 1944. Resource management became a central concern for both commands. The United States, drawing on domestic oil and a broad industrial base, could schedule extensive training flights for pilots in the continental United States and Hawaii before deployment. Fuel, spares, and training aircraft were allocated so that aviators built up flight hours in formation, flying, gunnery, and carrier approaches. Japanese training establishments, facing growing fuel shortages and increasing demands from the front, had to reduce the number of hours flown per trainee. Where pre-war courses had offered extensive live flight practice, wartime cohorts often relied more heavily on classroom instruction and limited flying, reducing their exposure to complex emergency situations before arrival at frontline A6M units. Psychological adaptation occurred at multiple levels. Pilots who survived early battles developed personal assessments of the opposing fighter. Some American aviators regarded the Zero as dangerous primarily if they accepted its preferred turning engagement, and as vulnerable to diving fire from above. Some Japanese pilots saw Wildcats as resistant to quick destruction and requiring concentrated bursts or attacks on vital areas to ensure a kill. Ground crews, repeatedly repairing damaged aircraft that had landed with multiple hits, formed their own impressions of structural strengths and weaknesses. These attitudes influenced how crews approached maintenance, with attention given to engine performance, control cables, and fuel systems that had proven decisive in previous sorties. Civilian populations in areas under or near contested airspace had to adjust to the persistent presence of these duels. In the Solomons and New Guinea, communities adapted daily routines to the rhythm of air raids, using natural cover or dugouts when aircraft appeared. In Alaska and the Aleutians, residents experienced air alerts and evacuation measures under subarctic conditions. In Japan, news of fighter operations and losses reached families through official announcements and personal letters. In the United States, accounts of Wildcat pilots operating from remote islands and small carriers appeared in newspapers and newsreels, framed within wider reports on the progress of the war. Institutionally, both navies created feedback systems to capture lessons from operations. Debriefing procedures were standardized, with forms covering engagement altitudes, headings, ammunition expenditure, and observed enemy behavior. Intelligence officers collated this data and produced summaries for distribution to squadrons and training units. For American forces, this contributed to a more formalized body of tactical guidance for Wildcat employment. For Japanese forces, similar efforts took place, but the rapid movement of units between fronts and the attrition of experienced personnel sometimes limited how far these lessons could be implemented in practice. By the time major Central Pacific operations were being planned, the duel between Wildcat and Zero had become embedded in a broader process of adaptation. Aircraft characteristics still mattered, but the ability to modify tactics, maintain pilot quality, and allocate scarce resources effectively began to shape outcomes as much as pure performance comparisons. The strategic balance in the Pacific began to shift decisively in late 1943 and 1944, and the contest between Wildcat and Zero formed one element of this turning point. As American forces advanced through the Gilberts and Marshalls, operations such as the assault on Tarawa in November 1943 and the capture of Kwajalein and Eniwetok in early 1944 relied on a combination of fleet and escort carriers. Fleet carriers increasingly embarked newer fighters, such as the F-6F, but escort carriers covering convoys and amphibious groups continued to operate F4Fs. Japanese air units defending these islands still included A6Ms, often reinforced from Truk or other central bases. In the airspace above lagoons and coral reefs, Wildcats from escort carriers supported landings, flew close air support, and engaged Zeros attempting to attack transports and supply ships. As the Central Pacific Campaign progressed, the role of the Wildcat evolved. On large carriers, it gradually ceded the primary fleet fighter role to newer types, but on smaller decks, it remained the standard. Escort carriers assigned to hunter-killer groups and amphibious task forces typically carried around 12 to 18 F-4Fs each. These aircraft provided anti-submarine patrols, convoy cover, and strike support against isolated Japanese garrisons. The endurance of the design and the continued training of pilots for carrier operations on shorter decks meant that the F-4F still played a visible part in the advance toward the Marianas and the Philippines. For Japan, holding the Central Pacific Islands required the allocation of A6M units to bases that were increasingly exposed to attack and difficult to supply. Airfields on Tarawa, Roy Namor, and later Saipan and Tinian hosted mixed formations of fighters and bombers with limited stocks of fuel and ammunition. Zeros tasked with intercepting American raids often took off from airfields already marked by bomb craters and damaged infrastructure. The attrition suffered in earlier campaigns meant that many pilots in these units had relatively few flight hours compared to the pre-war cadre. Training for complex carrier operations became harder to sustain, and more Zeros served from land bases, narrowing the range of tactical options. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 marked a major turning point in the air war, although the focus shifted toward newer fighters. The Japanese mobile fleet sortied with carriers carrying several hundred aircraft, including a substantial number of A6Ms serving both as fighters and as fighter bombers. The United States deployed a larger carrier force, with fleet carriers primarily operating F-6Fs, while escort carriers in the broader invasion force still flew F-4Fs in supporting roles. During the series of engagements, sometimes referred to collectively as the Marianas Turkey Shoot in later literature, American fighters inflicted heavy losses on Japanese carrier aircraft. While Wildcats were not at the center of these fleet air battles, their presence on escort carriers contributed to the defense of invasion convoys and to strikes on remaining island airfields where Zeros were based. From the Japanese perspective, the loss rates in the Philippine Sea had strategic implications that went beyond the immediate battle. Reports indicated that carrier air groups had been reduced to a fraction of their initial strength, with many A6M pilots killed or missing. Rebuilding these units would require training programs that fuel shortages and industrial constraints made difficult to sustain. For American planners, the destruction of a large portion of the remaining Japanese naval air arm meant that future operations, including the advance toward the Philippines and later Okinawa, would face reduced opposition from carrier-based fighters, although land-based A6Ms and other types would still appear over contested islands. At the operational level, the turning point also reflected changes in how both sides integrated fighters with other arms. The United States made extensive use of radar direction, combat information centers, and coordinated interception plans that linked Wildcats and newer fighters with shipboard controllers. Zeros operating from island bases often relied on visual spotting and less integrated control systems, particularly as radar sets and communications equipment were damaged or in short supply. This difference affected how efficiently each side could concentrate fighters at the right time and altitude to meet incoming raids or to protect their own strike groups. For civilians in regions affected by these operations, the turning point manifested in altered patterns of air activity and occupation. In the Marianas, inhabitants experienced intense bombardment from carrier aircraft and subsequent ground fighting as American forces captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. A6Ms defending these islands and Wildcats supporting landings were part of larger waves of aircraft that changed daily life, destroyed infrastructure, and forced evacuations or internment. In Japan, news of the battles in the Central Pacific, including references to the performance of the naval fighters, contributed to a gradual recognition that the strategic situation had worsened, even as official statements emphasized continued resistance. By late 1944, the duel between Wildcat and Zero had been partly overshadowed by newer designs and by the growing dominance of American carrier groups. Yet, in escort carrier operations, convoy defense, and support for amphibious landings, F-4Fs and A6Ms still met in the skies above islands and sea lanes. The turning point lay not only in which aircraft dominated specific engagements, but in the broader shift in production, training capacity, and operational doctrine that increasingly favored one side's ability to sustain and direct air power across the vast distances of the Pacific. By 1945, The duel between Wildcat and Zero was approaching its end as part of a broader collapse of Japanese military capability. On many fronts, A6M units still flew sorties, but they did so from airfields that lacked fuel, spare parts, and adequate ground support. Some were employed in conventional interception roles against carrier and land-based raids. Others were assigned to special attack missions, reflecting the shift in Japanese strategy toward attempts to damage invasion fleets at any cost. Many of the pilots involved in these late war operations had significantly fewer flight hours than their predecessors from 1941 to 1942. American carrier forces, by contrast, operated with increasing numerical and logistical support. Fleet carriers now embarked newer fighters in large numbers, while escort carriers accompanying convoys and landing forces still used F4Fs, particularly in the FM series built under license. These Wildcats flew anti-submarine patrols, convoy cover, and ground support missions in the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa campaigns. They met A6Ms and other Japanese aircraft less frequently than in earlier years, as the number of operational Japanese fighters declined, but encounters still occurred over shipping lanes, beachheads, and outlying islands. As ground campaigns advanced toward Japan, the physical spaces where the duel had taken place changed character. Airfields that had once hosted intense Wildcat Zero engagements were captured, repaired, and reused by American or Allied units. Wrecks of A6Ms and F4Fs lay around runways, in jungle clearings, and in lagoons, gradually stripped for usable parts or left to corrode. On Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, and in the Central Pacific, local communities lived among abandoned revetments, ammunition dumps, and aircraft remains, while occupying forces constructed new facilities on or near the same sites. The formal end of combat operations came after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. Following the announcement of acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the signing of the surrender on September 2, 1945, Japanese naval aviation units were ordered to stand down. Remaining A6Ms were grounded, disarmed, or scrapped under Allied supervision. Pilots and ground crews were demobilized, returning to civilian life in a country facing extensive material damage, food shortages, and occupation policies that restricted the reconstitution of military forces. In the United States and other Allied countries, demobilization followed a different pattern. Carrier air groups were reduced, and many F4Fs were withdrawn from frontline service as newer aircraft dominated post-war planning. Some Wildcats continued to serve in training or secondary roles for a period, while others were sold as surplus or scrapped. Former pilots returned to civilian occupations or remained in reduced peacetime naval and marine aviation branches. For shipbuilders and factory workers who had produced these aircraft, the transition brought cancellations of contracts, conversion to civilian production, or, in some cases, closures. The immediate consequences for those who had lived under or near the flight paths of these fighters were uneven. In the Pacific Islands, occupation brought new administrations, the clearing of unexploded ordnance, and negotiations over land that had been used for runways and bases. In Japan, former airfield communities faced the task of reconstructing homes and infrastructure around sites where Zeros had once taken off. Families of airmen on both sides dealt with the confirmation of missing relatives, the return of survivors, and the integration of veterans into societies adjusting to post-war conditions. Information about the technical and tactical aspects of the duel continued to circulate after fighting ceased. Allied technical teams examined captured A6Ms, airfields, and documentation, comparing them with their own aircraft and combat reports. Japanese specialists contributed to post-war interrogations and studies, explaining design choices, training methods, and operational experiences. In American and British reports, the Wildcat was assessed in relation to its wartime opponents and successors, while the Zero was analyzed as an example of a design optimized for a particular set of pre-war assumptions. The withdrawal from combat did not mean an immediate disappearance of the material traces of these fighters. Surplus F4s and captured or derelict A6Ms remained stored, displayed, or left in remote locations. Some were used in films, technical demonstrations, or research projects. Others were dismantled for scrap metal needed in reconstruction. At the same time, the institutional knowledge built up in naval aviation schools, staff colleges, and research establishments was retained, influencing the design of post-war carrier fighters and the development of doctrines that assume jets and radar as standard equipment rather than exceptions. In this way, the end of active fighting between Wildcats and Zeros involved not only the cessation of sorties, but also a larger process of demobilization, disarmament, and reorganization. The aircraft that had once symbolized offensive reach or defensive resilience were gradually removed from frontline inventories, while the individuals and communities who had built, maintained, and flown them adapted to a peacetime environment marked by both material scarcity and new political structures. In the decades after the war, the duel between Wildcat and Zero became a subject of technical analysis, veteran testimony, and public memory. Early post-war studies in the United States often contrasted the ruggedness and firepower of the F4F with the agility and range of the A6M, using combat reports and capture documents to reconstruct engagements. In Japan, designers and former pilots discussed the Zero as a response to specific pre-war needs: long-range escort, high maneuverability, and operation from limited bases and carriers. These assessments highlighted that both aircraft had been shaped by distinct doctrines, industrial capacities, and strategic expectations rather than by abstract engineering choices. Historians examining the air war in the Pacific placed the Wildcat Zero contest within broader debates about attrition, pilot training, and industrial output. Studies of pilot rosters and aircraft production figures showed how early Japanese advantages in experienced personnel and high-performance fighters gradually eroded as losses outpaced training and as fuel shortages constrained flight hours. Analyses of American records pointed to the accumulation of hundreds of F4Fs produced per year, matched by training systems that increased the number of carrier-qualified pilots. The outcome of the duel was therefore interpreted less as a simple comparison of turn rate or climb, and more as the interaction of tactical adaptation with the capacity to replace aircraft and crews. Tactical lessons extracted from these encounters influenced post-war doctrine. The experiences of Wildcat units contributed to an emphasis on cooperative maneuvers, energy management, and the integration of fighters with radar-directed control. Manuals and course materials in naval aviation schools use case studies from Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons to illustrate principles of interception, escort, and air defense that transcended specific aircraft types. Japanese accounts, including those compiled by post-war research teams, analyzed where initial doctrinal strengths, such as coordinated long-range strikes, had been undermined by insufficient replacement systems and by the vulnerability of lightly protected aircraft to evolving enemy tactics and armament. Public representations of the duel varied by country and period. In the United States, newsreels, later television documentaries, and popular histories often presented Wildcat pilots within narratives of carrier warfare and island campaigns, focusing on individual experiences while sometimes simplifying the technical and strategic context. In Japan, films, memoirs, and museum exhibits portrayed the Zero as both a product of pre-war industrial ambition and a symbol of the sacrifices of naval aviators. Over time, some presentations tended toward idealization, while others, drawing on archival research, emphasized the constraints under which engineers and pilots had operated. Researchers examining the economic and social dimensions of the war noted that the development and production of these fighters involved large networks of workers, suppliers, and local communities. Factories building F4Fs in the United States employed thousands of people, including women and minority workers, whose wartime roles contributed to later social changes. Japanese plants producing A6Ms operated under increasing pressure as the war progressed, facing shortages of raw materials and disruptions from bombing. In both countries, the end of production required reconversion to civilian goods, with consequences for employment and regional economies. International scholarly debates considered how far the Wildcat Zero duel influenced the overall course of the Pacific War. Some authors argued that air superiority in key campaigns shaped in part by the performance and employment of these fighters, was decisive in enabling amphibious operations and protecting sea lanes. Others placed greater emphasis on submarine warfare, logistics, or high-level strategic decisions. Most agreed that while no single aircraft determined the outcome, the interaction of Wildcat and Zero in early and mid-war battles revealed the strengths and weaknesses of the naval air systems that fielded them. In museums, commemorative sites, and private collections, surviving examples of F-4s and A6Ms became physical references for these discussions. Restored aircraft displayed in the United States, Japan, and other countries allowed visitors to see the relative size, construction, and cockpit layouts of the fighters. Interpretive materials frequently attempted to balance technical description with accounts of the pilots and ground crews who had operated them. For island communities where wrecks remained in situ, these remnants served both as reminders of the conflict and as artifacts incorporated into local narratives about wartime occupation and post-war rebuilding. The legacy of the Wildcat Zero duel thus spans multiple levels. At the operational level, it demonstrated how doctrinal assumptions, pilot training, and logistics could amplify or limit the qualities of a given aircraft. At the institutional level, it influenced post-war thinking about carrier air power, leading to doctrines that place greater emphasis on radar integration, pilot throughput, and resilience to attrition. At the social and cultural level, it contributed to national and local memories of the Pacific War, in which these fighters appear as recognizable symbols of a conflict that reshaped political boundaries, economies, and societies around the ocean where they once met in combat.